Hello again, Rockland High School anatomy students. We're going to hit part two of the respiratory system. This will set you up for the second quiz. And we're going to start here where we left off. Last place we left off, we talked about our ventilation capacities here, our volumes with our inspiratory reserve, tidal, expiratory, and residual. Now we're going to jump into gas exchange. So we've already ventilated the air. We got the air moving in and out of our lungs, but now we have to do the second part of respiration, which is actually exchange oxygen for CO2. So in order for this to happen, we've got to pass through the respiratory membrane. And the respiratory membrane is just this really thin uh, connection of tissue between the inside of our lungs, an alveoli, the inside of a blood vessel, and then a little fluid in between them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to this picture right here. Now, this is a super magnified picture. That's just one alveoli right here in purple. And then that right there is the nucleus of a simple squamous epithelial cell. It's just a single thin flat cell. And what that's doing is it's creating a membrane around the inside part here, which is full of air from the outside world. And then this oxygen is going to diffuse across this membrane into this red blood cell, and CO2 is going to diffuse from the blood right here out into the alveoli. The phagocyte is a white blood cell, and those patrol our alveoli here because the air has bacteria and things in it, and these guys can catch that before it gets into you, then it can stop that from having an infection. So we're looking at the cross section of the surface right here, and if we zone in on this little box right here and expand that with the arrow here to the big box, we can see our respiratory membrane in cross section. So we've got basically the one cell thick alveoli, the one cell thick blood vessel, and then this area in between that we call the interstitial space. And that's just a fancy way of saying that these two tissues are not the same thing. They're separate cell membranes, but they're smashed right next to each other. Like if you pressed your hands together as hard as you can, technically there's interstitial space between your hands because they're not one single continuous piece. They're two separate pieces smashed together completely, just like these are here. So the key to getting oxygen in and CO2 out is a surface area. So if you remember in our respiratory video where we did the heart and lung dissection, they showed a cross section of this in the video, and they showed someone who had emphysema and someone who had normal lungs, and the alveoli create a massive surface area so that there's a lot of space available to exchange oxygen for CO2. And this oxygen and CO2 exchange is set up by what we call partial pressures in the atmosphere. Now, this is just a fancy way of saying this. Out in the air around us in the earth, there is more oxygen than there is in the tissues inside of our body. So, oxygen, when it comes into our lungs, diffuses into our blood down a concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. It's easy. It doesn't require any energy. We don't have to pump the oxygen in. It's just like in the summertime when you're sitting in your car on a really hot day and you got the air conditioner in and it's nice in your car but super hot outside. And then you open the door and all the hot air rushes in and the cold air rushes out. It's not because someone had a fan going. It's because the high pressure of hot air is high outside and it moves into a low pressure area inside your car and it just moves right in there. The same is true with oxygen. And we flip that, the same is true for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has a higher concentration in your bloodstream than it does in the air outside of us. So carbon dioxide diffuses out into the atmosphere from our bloodstream. So, how do we transport these materials? Well, oxygen, when it moves into our bloodstream, attaches onto hemoglobin. You guys have probably heard that. And because it's got a higher partial pressure out in the atmosphere, it diffuses. It doesn't require any energy to do that. It just attaches to the hemoglobin, moves through our body tissues. And then when it gets to our body's tissue in those small little capillaries, what happens is your body's using up oxygen. So there, the concentration of oxygen is lower than it is in the bloodstream. The hemoglobin lets go of the oxygen, and the oxygen goes toward the tissue with a lower pressure or a lower partial pressure of oxygen. But once again, it's diffusion. Carbon dioxide is different. Carbon dioxide is made from our cells when they're doing cellular respiration, but carbon dioxide As soon as it leaves the cell and it hits the water out there in the blood plasma around our body, immediately it's changed. It becomes carbonic acid, it loses a hydrogen ion, and then becomes this solid material called bicarbonate. And then it moves in our blood plasma as this solid bicarbonate until it gets to our lungs. Then, when it gets to our lungs, an enzyme that powered this in the first place changes that bicarbonate back into a gas, and then the CO2 is relieved from our body as we exhale. Well, CO2 takes quite a journey where it goes as a gas, where it's originally released from our cells in our body, changes into a solid in our bloodstream, and then back into a gas again when it leaves our bodies and we breathe it out. Oh, flip down into this picture right here. So this is just a picture showing the path of CO2 without the explanation here so much, just the first part. So CO2 right here is produced in our cells with cellular respiration. And originally, this is CO2 as a gas. I should label that picture right there, gas. And then the CO2 mixes with water in our blood plasma. Out here, where the red blood cells are in the plasma, becomes this carbonic acid and then changes to bicarbonate. Now, when the hydrogen leaves right here, what happens is that makes the blood, it lowers the pH value and it makes the blood a little more acidic. So, out in our body tissues, our blood is a little more acidic. It's got a lower pH. And toward our lungs, our blood is a little more basic and it's got a little bit higher pH. So, our body's average pH value is pretty much neutral, right at about 7. But this is a really important part of respiration because respiration isn't just for getting oxygen in and CO2 out, but it's also maintaining our body's pH level. Our bodies are actually pretty good at adjusting to different oxygen levels. I don't know if you've ever gone up to like Lake Tahoe or high up in the mountains, and you might be short of breath for a little while, or maybe even the entire time you're there. It takes a few months for your body really to accommodate. But people do things, like climb Mount Everest, 15, 20,000 feet. Even if they have to use an oxygen tank, they acclimatize their body. Our bodies do not acclimatize to pH. They're really, really sensitive to changes in pH. So we have to monitor that carefully, and we do that through respiration. Moving to the next picture here, and this is showing the other end of it, so getting the CO2 out of our blood into the alveoli. So part A right here is talking about the previous picture. This is for A, and then this picture right here is for B. So if you follow the whole pattern, I think that this little paragraph right here sums this up perfectly. Out at the tissue level, carbon dioxide enters the red blood cells and the plasma, combines with water, and forms this carbonic acid. There's an enzyme that catalyzes this, disassociates some hydrogen, and then it becomes this bicarbonate, this solid material. And the release of that hydrogen causes a reduction in pH, the pH value, so it makes our blood a little more acidic. Then this travels through our body and then gets to part B, which is finally gets to our lungs. In the lung capillaries, the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ions combine again to form back to carbonic acid. This reduction in the hydrogen causes an increase in the pH, so our blood becomes a little more basic. The carbonic acid then then comes in contact with water, is released as water and carbon dioxide, and our carbon dioxide out here, right there, is now a gas again, just the same way it was when it started out as a gas in our cells and we produced it through cellular respiration. Now, all of this is controlled by our nervous system, and we constantly are monitoring our body through our autonomic nervous system to determine whether or not we need to increase or decrease our respiration. The respiratory center in the brain is the medulla oblongata and in the pons. And if we flash ahead right here, we can see that those right here are down here in our lower brain. So these are very basic functions. And that route right there is very simple that comes into the diaphragm and our intercostals to help control our breathing. Labored breathing, during heavy breathing, that's when we have to actually stimulate some other muscles, maybe the intercostals or the abdominals, to help us continue with this. And then this Herring-Brewer reflex, this is very simple. All this means is that when you stretch the diaphragm, when it relaxes and contracts, it comes back to its contraction point again. But I just want to look at this picture real quick, right here with the medulla oblongata and the pons. You can see that these are in your lower segment of the brain. and they're paying attention to chemoreceptors. Now, we've heard this term before. We've talked about chemoreceptors. Right here, carbon dioxide is the major regulator, and increases or decreases in carbon monoxide, what they do is they stimulate the chemoreceptors in these two places, either cause us to exhale or inhale more, because oxygen we can actually live with high and low or higher and lower levels of oxygen. I know it seems like we always talk about oxygen and people breathing oxygen in, but CO2 is the major regulator, because when there's a lot of CO2, that's going to affect our blood pH. And our body does not have the ability to deal with changes in blood pH. So chemoreceptors, chemical receptors in our arteries, the carotid arteries and some in the aorta, these stimulate these respiratory centers to give us feedback on how to ventilate in order to properly manage our body's pH level. Now, when we're exercising, this also has an effect on ventilation. We have these other receptors called mechanoreceptors. And these mechanoreceptors or proprioceptors are in our joints. And when our joints are moving, when we're exercising, when they're doing stuff, we're getting feedback to our brain. And our brain understands that the more we move, the more we exercise, the more we're going to be creating CO2 and the more we need to increase our respiration rate. So that movement actually triggers our breathing. And this is kind of a learned reflex too. I see this in track and field early in the season. People go out for a little jog and their bodies aren't ready to deal with this yet. They don't know how to deal with that increased movement. And I see people overventilating, just bent over, hands on their knees, kind of breathing uncontrollably. And then what happens is your body learns. Your body learns how to associate the rate of movement with how much CO2 you're going to produce and how to match that with your ventilation. And you also form more mitochondria, which means that you're using oxygen more efficiently. Your body pumps that oxygen more efficiently and the CO2 out as well as you gradually get into shape for whatever kind of cardiovascular exercise you're doing. So, not only are chemoreceptors giving us feedback on how to adjust ventilation, but we also have proprioceptors or mechanoreceptors that are stimulated by movement that tell us how to affect ventilation. So these last two segments right here on gas exchange and nervous control are quiz number 2. Things that you're going to want to pay attention to in quiz number 2. So understand the idea of diffusion and how oxygen diffuses into our blood and CO2 diffuses out. The respiratory membrane, just these three little parts, the one cell of the alveoli, the one cell of the red blood cell, and the interstitial space. I'm not going to ask you to memorize this chemical equation, but I want you to know the concept that CO2 is carried by hemoglobin and it just moves from high to low concentration. Or sorry, CO2. Oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. It moves from high to low concentration. But CO2 takes a little more complex path. It goes from a gas into a solid bicarbonate and then back to a gas. So here it starts as a gas, goes into a solid bicarbonate, and then at the lungs goes from that solid bicarbonate back to a gas. And in that process, it changes our body's pH level, the balance between acid and base. That's a really important factor for our body in maintaining pH. All right, guys, best of luck to you on quiz number 2. I will be posting the next materials on the digestive system soon.